It is my privilege to introduce this next panel to the Commission. This is the first of the panels of the ilk that Lisa described to us, where we will be able to hear from an ethicist, a practitioner, and someone whose incidental findings were affected in some unique way. In this particular panel, we will focus on the research environment, and our first speaker is Dr. Alex John London, Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He's an elected fellow of the Hastings Center and a recipient of the Distinguished Service Award from the American Society for Bioethics and the Humanities, and his work has appeared in Science, Lancet, PLOS Medicine, and the Hastings Center Report, among others. And he's been commissioned to write papers by the CDC and the Institute of Medicine. He's a member of the working group on the revision of the 2002 SIOMS International Ethical Guidelines in Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects. And in 2011, he was appointed to the Steering Committee on Forensic Science Programs for the International Commission on Missing Persons. Since 2007, he has served as a member of the Ethics Working Group of the HIV Prevention Trials Network. And Dr. London's research focuses on foundational issues in research with human participants, issues of social justice in the transnational context, and on methodological issues in theoretical and applied ethics. Welcome, Dr. London.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagner. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to speak about the obligations that researchers owe to study participants and how these are distinct from the obligations of clinicians to patients, recognizing that this question is asked against the background of incidental findings. Confusion about the roles and responsibilities of clinicians and researchers has played a critical role in the development of research ethics. Several now infamous cases of research abuse, including the Tuskegee syphilis study, were made possible by the willingness and the ability of researchers to use their credentials as caregivers to gain access to the bodies of people who were then surreptitiously and unscrupulously conscripted into research. One of the early goals of research ethics, therefore, was to clearly demarcate research from clinical care and to require that people only be invited to participate in clinical research after being adequately informed about the activity's status as research, about what was required by participation, and about the various and associated risks and benefits. An ongoing challenge to the informed consent process thus concerns how to ensure that people understand that research participation differs from receiving clinical care. So I want to begin with some important contrasts. Research is the social enterprise of generating new knowledge. It serves the legitimate social purpose of supplying the information base necessary to understand human conduct, human health, to create, assess, and improve interventions, and ultimately, in the context of medical research, to improve the ability of health systems to understand and to meet the needs of the populations that they serve. In contrast, clinical care is the social enterprise of bringing to bear current knowledge, expertise, and interventions to address the health needs of individual patients. Each of these is a legitimate social undertaking that promotes distinctive social and individual goods. Insofar as researchers and clinicians are empowered to act in the furtherance of these undertakings and goods, they acquire different privileges and responsibilities. In particular, the explicit purpose of the clinical relationship is to advance the medical interests of the individual patient. Clinicians have strong fiduciary duties to patients, meaning that they have the duty to place the interests of the patient above almost all other competing concerns. Moreover, they have these duties because they possess distinctive knowledge and expertise that patients lack, on which patients must rely in order to preserve or advance momentous individual interests related to the avoidance of suffering, preserving and promoting their health and longevity. When clinicians contemplate recommending diagnostic tests or other therapeutic procedures, therefore, they must ensure that the risks associated with these tests and procedures are reasonable in light of their impact on the interests of the individual patient on whom they are performed. In contrast, in order to generate new knowledge, researchers often must subject study participants to diagnostic tests or study-related procedures to which those individuals would not be subjected in the context of ordinary clinical care. Extra biopsies or blood tests required to generate study data are typical examples. In many instances, the risks associated with these procedures cannot be justified by the prospect that they will advance the health interests of individual recipients. Rather, it is recognized as permissible within clinical research, under appropriate conditions, to expose participants to risks that are ultimately justified not by the prospect of direct individual benefit, but by their contribution to generating important information. It's also important to recognize that research with human participants is a much broader social activity than is medical care. Some medical research takes place in clinical settings and is deeply entangled with the provision of medical care. A trial comparing the relative efficacy of 2 approved blood pressure medications would be a clear example. However, a phase 1 study of the pharmacokinetics of a new drug may involve medical procedures that are carried out by people who are also clinicians. But such studies are often conducted in healthy volunteers and offer no prospect of direct benefit to the participant and are not intended to do so. Other research is even more remote from the clinical setting, such as neuroscience and behavioral research, research with human tissue, or research with identifiable data. Much of this research is conducted by researchers with PhDs in fields from basic sciences, computer sciences, social sciences, and even the humanities. So while some of the individuals who work as researchers also act as clinicians in other contexts, there are a significant number of researchers who lack the knowledge or the expertise and the credentials to act as a clinician. Moreover, even when research involves medical equipment, such as imaging devices, these devices are often not used in research in ways that would be adequate for diagnostic purposes in the clinical setting. Having said all this, I now want to emphasize that the idea that the obligations of medical researchers are exhausted by their duties to advance science has a long and ugly history. It has been used to justify harm, mistreatment, disrespect, or neglect of research participants on the ground that research advances a greater good. The traditional reaction to this tendency, I believe, is a misguided effort to appeal to the duties of clinicians as a check or a curb on the very real potential for abuse latent in the idea that research is an essentially utilitarian enterprise. This appeal to obligations of clinicians is misguided in part because not all researchers are clinicians, and because it diverts attention away from more general values that ought to guide and constrain the researcher-patient relationship. I've argued that one of the accomplishments of bioethics in general, and of research ethics in particular, has been to bring the institutions of medical research and clinical practice into better conformity with liberal democratic values of respect for the dignity and equal moral standing of all persons. These are not specifically role-related values. They are values that either apply generally to each person's interaction with other persons or specifically to the way that important social institutions have to be structured in order to merit the trust of people understood as free and equal participants in a system of mutually beneficial social cooperation. As such, even if we recognize that in order to generate socially valuable knowledge, we have to permit researchers to do things that clinicians should not do, it doesn't follow that this privilege is unbounded. Rather, if the diverse community members in whose name research is ostensibly carried out are to see it as an avenue through which they can contribute to the common good, then they must have a credible public assurance that they can participate in research without being subject to indifference, neglect, harm, or abuse in the process. To bring this back to incidental findings, I think we have to look at 3 things. 1, the way that specific research activities implicate the interests of participants. 2, at the reasonable steps that researchers can take to show respect for the interests of participants. And 3, at how any such requirements would affect the integrity of the research system. As research becomes more invasive, or as it involves activities that are capable of uncovering sensitive information about a person's health or other interests, the participants who make such research possible become vulnerable to neglect and abuse, and they depend on researchers to protect their momentous interests. The features of vulnerability, dependence, and asymmetric knowledge and expertise that generally give rise to the clinician's duty of personal care may thus give rise, in some specific cases, to an analogous duty on the part of the researcher to act in ways that are necessary to protect the interests of study participants. This may involve a duty to disclose to the participant information that is outside of the study scope, and perhaps link the participant to a professional who can provide appropriate assistance. It may also involve keeping information, including information that is not disclosed, confidential. Finally, although I do think that there are circumstances in which researchers have a duty to disclose incidental findings to study participants, it is not clear to me that anything that I've said here would support something like a general obligation to look for such findings. Now, I have to speak broadly about all kinds of research. Moving in this direction would have a significant effect on the integrity of the research enterprise. It would divert research resources from research to the search for non-research related findings, and it may require training and expertise that many researchers lack. It may also have unintended effects on prospective participants, some of whom may regard the disclosure of such findings as a risk that would serve as a deterrent to research participation. Thank you, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Dr. London, we appreciate those very rich comments. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Bandettini. I believe I got it right that time, and I apologize again. He is the chief of the section on functional imaging methods in the Laboratory of Brain and Cognition of the Intramural Research Program at the NIH, National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH. There, he is also director of the Functional MRI Core Facility. And Dr. Bandettini has investigated methods to increase the interpretability, resolution, and applicability of fMRI techniques. He's been awarded the Scientific Director's Merit Award for his efforts in establishing the NIH fMRI Core Facility and the Wiley Young Investigator Award at the annual Organization of Human Brain Mapping meetings. In 2005, he served as president of the Organization for Human Brain Mapping and is currently editor-in-chief of the journal NeuroImage. His laboratory is currently developing MRI methods to improve the spatial resolution, temporal resolution, sensitivity, interpretability, and applicability of fMRI. Welcome, Dr. Bandettini.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. My comments are going to be when I prepared this this talk, I actually tried to make it frame the problem as simply as possible, and other introductions have been a little bit better, but actually I think that what I'm going to try to do right here is just frame the primary issue and just to re-emphasize some points that I think are important to me. First of all, I'm a researcher. I'm not an MD, and I've been doing fMRI research for about 20 years now, and I've come across some incidental findings, and so this is the way I actually look at this issue. So doing the research, there's about 2% of normal research volunteers have an incidental finding of clinical significance. And it's actually unknown how many truly benefit from follow-up on this. Those statistics are not available. And then the question then is, okay, so what should be done procedurally? So just a little bit of background, what I think are the related issues. First of all, active brain screening can be expensive and has no clear benefit, at least in the context of neuroimaging, over treatment following symptoms. So for instance, people can be walking around with tumors all their lives and not have any manifestation of that. So there's obviously other imaging modalities for looking at other parts of the body that are useful, but in the context of the brain, it's a little bit less useful. So false positives are a real risk. They can have deleterious effects, impact on otherwise normal subjects. As was mentioned before, it can obviously infect people's insurance and so on. And it's very difficult to necessarily quell those concerns once they've been brought up, even if they're not clinical. So, and also, this is, I think, the most important thing that's actually been mentioned in the context of genetics as well, but very different for imaging, and that is most research scans are not clinical grade. In that when I collect functional MRI data, and so I run a facility that we have 30 PIs, they collect either functional or some anatomical data. It's the functional scans are incredibly low resolution. The anatomic contrast is very low. And even the anatomic images that are collected with the functional scans are not clinical grade. So for instance, if somebody does report some symptoms, they go into a clinic, they might have a very high resolution scan, and they might have something like gadolinium or external contrast agents added where people are specifically looking for something. And the question is whether we should be doing that as well if we're not looking for something. And then the next point along those lines then is that most researchers are not qualified to read scans for diagnoses. So including myself, for instance, when I came across one subject who I thought had an incidental finding, they had very large ventricles, and I was concerned that they had very large ventricles. And And this was when I was still a graduate student, and I showed them the scan. I said, "Oh, this looks really scary," and we finally went to a radiologist who then said, "Oh no, that's within the realm of normal." But I mean, what happened though is that the researcher was alarmed, and I think they still had some residual alarm after that as well. So those are very real issues that came from somebody who was trying to interpret a scan who wasn't qualified to do that. So, and also you have, as I mentioned before, the prevalence of lifelong asymptomatic individuals who might have lesions or tumors. That statistic is unknown as well. So we just don't know that. So this is a detailed, basically one study. There's two studies right here. I just wanted to simply show that too much information right here to really talk about. But basically, the incidence over as more and more studies come in is about 2%. And that's pretty much the main figure. It goes up as people increase in age. Above 60 or 70 years old, it gets close to 8% or 10%. But it's about 2%. And both this study and this other study showed that. So and just to emphasize from one of the papers that I referred to for extra information is that so researchers who obtain consent from volunteers to provide information about the prevalence of incidental brain findings on brain MRI, the higher prevalence with higher resolution sequences, and the shortage of evidence to inform their management. And I just want to bring out one point here is that really the harder you look, the more you'll find, and it's a continuum. It's not a discrete function. So with our research grade scans, we won't really find much, and we're not really looking. If we decide, we have an obligation to look more, we'll find more. And really, if you do clinical grade scans, you'll more likely find even more. So where do you draw that line in terms of how much effort you put into the quality of your research scans? And this is another quote from one of the papers as well. Brain MR screening in asymptomatic patients, regardless of age, medical history, is an example of an ineffective screening program that would produce many inconsequential findings and an exceedingly low rate of clinically relevant findings. So valuable screening programs must either address a highly prevalent disease or be applied to high-risk individuals and must accurately uncover a treatable disease. In other words, here they're basically saying in the context of screening, and I know that's different than doing research and looking for things, but the similarities are that this paper argues that you really should be looking for something in order if you're collecting all this multidimensional information. Otherwise, you might have more false positives, and you might miss a lot, and so it's really not exactly the right place to put this type of effort, in the context of research at least. And okay, so once again, this is more detail than you need to see, and I'll just summarize this. So there's a whole spectrum of how clinical centers go about handling incidental finding procedures in research, and it's wide open. It's still kind of like the Wild West in some ways, in that some clinical centers have scanners that are used not in a clinical setting. So they have a very minimal type of procedure in which no action is taken beyond articulating a plan for handling incidental findings in the informed consent process. So, the unqualified person, if they happen to see something, they'll refer to a radiologist potentially. Well, actually, that's even less than that. They might even say, we're not going to even look. If we think we see something, we're not going to tell you. And there's a whole continuum of what people can do all the way up to where I'm actually at the NIH. We have an extremely conservative approach. All people doing research scans have to also get a clinical grade scan once a year. We have repeat volunteers, and even the repeat volunteers have to come back every single year, have a clinical grade scan that then is read by a radiologist. The cost overhead of this and the infrastructure is somewhat high. Some people argue about what the actual cost is. I also think it's a little bit burdensome for the researcher as well. So there's all types of things in between that are, once again, potentially dangerous. Having a radiologist, for instance, try to interpret a research grade scan is difficult. They're going to make more errors, either negative or positive. So then the question is, should there be a standard policy? Should there be should it be a wide open policy? Should it be tailored to specific needs and specific resources of the clinical center or the research center? And that's sort of unknown right now. And lastly, this is actually from a talk from Judy Isles gave, and I'm not going to focus on, once again, the details, but these are the various decision points at which a person could make a decision as to what to do about the incidental finding or how to manage incidental findings. And so there's several different decision points where I have question marks are the unknowns. Like, for instance, how do we actually detect the incidental finding, for instance, and who is qualified to read the scans and when? And when they read the scans, who pays for the follow-up? Who actually pays for the subject to go to their physician to get follow-up scans or follow-up research? Okay, so lastly, as I finish up here, so framing the challenge, at least the way I see it. On one hand, we want to catch anything that obviously might be significant to the health of the subject. On the other hand, what exactly would justify the added cost and burden risk of false positives, as well as the fact that the overall effectiveness of screening is unclear? And so therefore, can we even put it in this framework of what incidence rate would justify what effort, even an effort of limited effectiveness and clear risks? So with that, I'd like to just conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It'll be interesting to, when we get to the full panel roundtable, to compare and contrast views on these things. Our last speaker for the panel has a unique relationship to this topic that we're discussing. Sarah Hilgenberg is a clinical instructor of general pediatrics in the Department of Pediatrics at the Lucile Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. She is also the physician lead on patient experience, where she works to integrate patient experience and clinical outcomes. And prior to her work at Children's Hospital, Dr. Hilgenberg was a general pediatrics hospitalist at Seattle Children's Hospital, where she completed her residency in general pediatrics. Of interest to us, special interest to us today, is that while she was a medical student at Stanford and at the School of Medicine, Dr. Hilgenberg volunteered for a research study. It's a study involving fMRI, which revealed a potentially life-saving incidental finding that resulted in neurosurgery. And we are looking forward to hearing your story. Thank you for being here today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my story with you and to contribute to this really important dialogue. I didn't know this, but that actually was my brain up there on Dr. Bandatini's slides. Judy Ellis. No, it's okay. Yeah. So to give you a little more context than I had planned, but it's fine. Judy Ellis was at Stanford, as was Gary Glover, whose names were all on the bottom of that slide. And this all sort of came together at this time and has taken off in the neuroimaging world, at least. So I'm one of the people as part of that story. So I'm humbled to be here and never imagined ever that my experience with my own incidental finding could potentially help others in this way. So at this time of the year, 11 years ago, I was preparing to leave on a solo 7-week backpacking adventure to Western Europe. I was a hardworking, high-achieving, strong-willed, type A 20-something. I had graduated from a great college with distinction. I had been an all-American soccer player. I was then finishing a wonderful 2 years as a clinical researcher in neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. And my dreams were continuing to come true. I had been accepted to Stanford University School of Medicine for admission that fall. I was high on life, feeling emotionally, physically, and intellectually fulfilled. And I looked forward to the challenges and new beginnings that lay ahead. So it was that a few short months later, in August 2002, I left Boston, where I had grown up, in my small, tightly packed car for a week-long cross-country trip. Through the side mirrors, I watched everything familiar disappear. I had decided to leave the Northeast, my family, and most of my friends in pursuit of an adventure. Little did I know that this adventure would quickly become more than I ever could have imagined. Not only would I begin to study the art and science of medicine, but I would also learn perhaps the most difficult lesson of all, how to be a patient. As part of orientation, I spent 4 days camping in the Sierra Nevadas with 6 of my new classmates and 2 second-year leaders. Around 2 weeks after our return, my camping group received an email from Matt, one of our leaders, who was a graduate student at the time pursuing his PhD in functional MRI. His email said the following, quote, "I hope the first week of anatomy wasn't too painful. I had 2 subjects cancel on me for brain scanning tomorrow morning. Would any of you be interested in having your brain scanned, parentheses MRI, not X-ray, close parentheses, while doing a memory test, end quote. Without hesitation, I signed up. It would be $40 in my pocket, and as a new student, I thought, great. I was helping a new friend, and I thought maybe I would learn something. So at noon the next day, I reported to the campus imaging center. I glanced over and signed in informed consent, which I didn't remember at the time, but looking back on it, I found. And I considered only for a moment, and then summarily dismissed the possibility of an unexpected finding, then settled into the MRI machine. You have a beautiful brain, Matt related to me after the first of 4 scans. Of course I do, I had thought. After 90 minutes, Matt rescued me from my isolation. Though his barrage of questions from this point on was strange, I answered unfazed. No, I had not had any headaches recently. No problem with eyesight, no other unusual symptoms. When I asked to see the scans, Matt quickly gathered his materials and ushered me out, explaining that we did not have time. I thought no more of it and switched my focus to the apple crisp I planned to prepare that evening for a party. Later that afternoon, while I stood at the sink peeling pounds of Granny Smiths, my phone rang. Matt was calling. Voice wavering, he said, "We found something on your scan." He had seen an abnormality on the 3rd scan of the series and had rushed me out to confirm the finding. My recollection is that he located one of his mentors, a pediatric neurologist who just happened to be on campus, to whom he showed the images. I have since heard that Matt may have discussed the issue with the director of the imaging center and a radiologist. Regardless, unsure of a diagnosis because of the non-clinical quality of the scans, they wanted me seen immediately. As you saw in the images, you might imagine why. So in tears, I asked my brand new roommate to drive me to the Stanford University Hospital emergency room, where I met up with Matt and the neurologist in order to be evaluated. In a state of utter disbelief, I arrived at the ER. I was ushered into a private room, one I now know to be a place where providers often deliver bad news to families. There, I waited while an MRI technician was called in from an hour away. While I waited, the dean of students, whom I had barely met, visited me in tears to let me know that I had the school support. A touching but terrifying gesture. I learned later that those initially involved had thought that I had had a brain tumor. I phoned my mother in Boston, trying to explain while sobbing what had happened without knowing the details. Unable to reach my father and stepmother, both physicians, in New York, I continued to try until I succeeded with one of those awful phone calls that every parent dreads, waking them out of sleep to tell them that something was terribly wrong. Ultimately, that Saturday afternoon into evening, I was evaluated by an ER physician and the neurosurgical service. I underwent a diagnostic MRI and then was brought into a small dark room to look at the images and to receive the diagnosis from the pediatric neurologist who had accompanied me earlier that day. "Sarah, what you have is an AVM. Do you know what this is?" It stands for arteriovenous malformation. "Have you heard of the Circle of Willis?" Though I would come to love the Circle of Willis, at the time he spoke a foreign language, and the rest of what he told me is a blur. I do not know whose choice this was, but I ended up being admitted to the hospital that night through the following morning for quote-unquote psychosocial reasons, I was told. I stayed up the entire night alone and terrified, and was discharged the following morning in a continued state of shock. I went to class for a few days, telling only a few classmates what had transpired. My parents flew out just in time for my white coat ceremony, and then an appointment with the chief of neurosurgery at Stanford, who happened to specialize in AVMs. My parents then left, and I stayed in California to continue to attend class, agonizing over what I should do, but feeling the need to stay occupied. The following week, I had an angiogram. On the basis of the results, my physicians recommended that I undergo 2 embolizations and a resection. Knowing that the AVM could bleed, I chose not to postpone treatment for too long and scheduled the procedures like any good student for Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks. In the meantime, I elected to stay in medical school, and as you can probably imagine, life as a student proved very difficult. I was learning firsthand the material taught in class, the vulnerability of the body, and in particular my brain, the organ ultimately responsible for getting me into Stanford. I underwent my first embolization after classes finished, but before finals began. I lay in bed for about 48 hours afterward with a truly debilitating headache. It was difficult for me to walk for a few days afterward because of soreness in my groin where they had accessed my femoral artery. I took my finals early, then had a second embolization, and ultimately a definitive resection. Though longer than anticipated, the surgery went well. Following a post-procedural angiogram, my neurosurgeon delivered the news I was cured. He was pleased to have resected the 3.5 centimeter frontal lobe AVM because he thought it most likely would have caused a devastating bleed. The physical recovery of the surgery was remarkably not as difficult as the emotional recovery. I struggled with post-surgical depression, which I have since learned is relatively common. I decided to take an extra year of medical school so as to spread out my coursework in order to find a balance with extracurricular activities, including research, teaching, and athletics. And I spent a lot of energy trying to make sense of all that had happened. 3 months after my surgery, I met with my neurosurgeon and was officially discharged from his clinic because he no longer needed to follow me. I have had no adverse health sequelae. I believe that I have had the best outcome I probably could have had. A few years after my surgery, I met my husband, who happens to be a pediatric cardiology fellow who performs genetic research on congenital heart disease, so this is also a part of our daily lives. I graduated medical school to complete a pediatric residency at Seattle Children's Hospital and University of Washington. I have a promising and fulfilling professional life as a pediatric hospitalist at a major academic center, enjoying both the privilege to help patients and families work through their illnesses and occasionally their own incidental findings, and to help shape the future of medicine by teaching residents and medical students. In 2011, my husband and I had a daughter, Hannah, who is the most special person in our lives. I am so unbelievably thankful that I no longer had an AVM in my brain during childbirth, as I learned that this is a common time for one to bleed. So, while I am just one research subject whom none of you had met prior to today, I am a really important person in a few other people's lives. I am grateful that Matt decided to tell his superiors about my scan. A part of me thinks that he had no obligation to do this. But I am not sure that I would be here today to speak to you if he had not acted. So I do think it is important to try to have a plan in place to address these issues as they arise. Thank you again so much for inviting me to be here with you today.
Well, you are most welcome, and thank you for coming and adding powerfully to 3 different perspectives on the issue of incidental findings related to research. Colleagues, who wants to begin questioning? John, was you? John? Christine and Dan, by the way, you guys have a pass if you want to begin. I should.
I'll use mine
Actually,
at
I'm gonna do
the
that.
panel.
I'm going to do that. I've got you, the other two, yeah.
Oh, do you want me to start? Thanks for a really interesting panel. Alex, I'm puzzling over the obligation to inform patients of incidental findings or come to their aid in some way. If we switch from the standard fiduciary model of the physician-patient relationship to your model, which, as I take it, is based on sort of, liberal democratic principles of equal respect and equality, okay? So when we're dwelling in the fiduciary model, it's fairly direct and clear what impels a caregiver to provide that assistance in the presence of a really dramatic incidental finding, okay? He or she is my patient, they're vulnerable, I have more knowledge, more power, I have an obligation to come to their assistance. I need some help in fleshing out your account, of how it is that a non-fiduciary model would get us to roughly a similar result in a lot of these cases, okay? Because it seems to me that the standard liberal political theory values tend to be sort of framed in negative terminologies, respect the autonomy of the individual and so on, okay? So what is it within your integrative model that provides the impetus to assist? as opposed to anybody else in the community who just is passing by and just happens to know something.
Yeah, thanks. So what I would say is that there's not a cookie cutter, in the sense that when you have the underlying fiduciary duty, then you have broad-based justification. When it's lacking, then you have a variety of different kinds of encounters of different depth, of different significance over different times, different degrees of vulnerability that are arising. And so what I would look to are, you look at the factors that underwrite when it is that you have a fiduciary duty. So when there is asymmetric knowledge, when there is vulnerability, when the person has, if you go back to Henry's model, when the person has made themselves vulnerable or entrusted a particular part of their care to someone. And then I think the relevant question then is, so how do we, understanding that researchers' job is to ask, generate data, ask questions, answer very specific questions. How do we reconcile that with the need to treat study participants as more than just data points in this, right? I mean, they're real people with whom you're engaging, and you're learning private information about them. And if that private information is clearly significant for their health, then I think there you would say you have sort of a duty grounded in beneficence and the special access that you have to this person's body to respond to them in a way that shows respect for their interests. I think that becomes muddier as you add uncertainty. I think Dr. Hilgenberg's narrative was really important and nice, because there was a lot of discussion of the anxiety that she went through before this was confirmed. And so you can imagine the case where Matt is wrong, and they come in and they say, whew, it turns out, it wasn't anything, but there was still all the distress and everything that had happened. And so I think that's why, without the umbrella of a general duty, you have to make more nuanced decisions that factor in, how reliable is this information, and the features of vulnerability that we mentioned.
Amy, you said you had a quick follow-up before we go to
I
Archie?
just have something that I think just needs to be said. So Dr. Hilgenberg's story is one that I think every human being can relate to in a way that doesn't decide the many difficult issues we have, but it does speak to something that Dr. London and Dr. Green and Dr. Cho and Dr. Cowan, a lot of people have either specifically said or alluded to, which is there is a kind of minimal standard of what human beings who have a basic ethical sensibility will say to themselves, if I don't do this, I can't sleep at night. There are some incidental findings, take the clinical setting away, because there is a fiduciary duty, but in research, or I would say we should question in direct to consumer, where something jumps out at you that's so possibly threatening to somebody's health and well-being that it's a minimal human duty to do something. Now, not to do something foolish, not to do something rash, to do something with caring and finding the people who have the expertise to help. But it seems to me that we owe it as a commission to take a story that is a true story and basically recognize that sometimes you may not have a legal obligation. It's even a question of whether there's a duty, but not to do something would be so obviously wrong. And I don't think you have to be a liberal Democrat or a conservative or any other thing to recognize this. So I just wanted to say that there are some things that when you find out about them and they affect a human being, possibly could, save their lives, that it's the right thing to do.
Could I just reply really quickly? Thank you so much for saying that. When I was speaking to my husband after this invitation about what I wanted to say just that at the end of my comments, but felt that it needed context, and so I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I had a question for Alex London. I mean, I thought that, if I understood correctly, there were 2 points that you were trying to make. And one of them is that research results should not be reported back to the individuals. And I think we heard comments now, from both Sarah and from our chair about circumstances where that would be appropriate. But the other point that you made also is that revealing such information might actually prevent individuals from participating in research studies. And I just wanted to get your opinion on this following you, which is completely different. And there are some people who believe that, as the name indicates, people who participate in research studies are called human subjects. They're subjects, right? And that notion that they're subjects and that they're not real partners in research is actually hindering the ability to be able to bring people into research. And many people who, whose drives and motivations for participating in studies is not only to provide, information for the society, but also to obtain information about themselves. So how do we reconcile this view, and what do you think about the view of changing the way that we think about this, and human, individuals who contribute to research studies should not be considered as subjects, but as partners in that endeavor?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, I agree with the last thing that you said. I'd like to go back to a point that was made in the first presentation. People participate in research for diverse motives. That is, researchers, participants, the people who fund it. So it's not necessarily that everybody's out solely to improve the standard of care. People want to make money. They want to get access to health care. They want all these other things. That's not something you can change. The goal of this sort of system-level view that I'm encouraging you to take is to say, look, how do we design a system that can manage those diverse motives so that all the relevant stakeholders can be confident that even though people participate in this for diverse motives, it's still going to do the thing that we want it to do, namely generate valuable science. So I think that's the tension here in research, that you want research to generate information. It's a valuable social activity. There's scarce resources to do it, mostly because of the funding decisions that people make, not because of innate scarcity. And the more that you divert resources away from that, then the less science that you're going to have. Now, having said that, though, I think there is this constraint that the people that are who participate in research, you want them to participate as a partner. You want them to have buy-in to, I think this is important, that's why I want to contribute to it. I may also want to get these other things, but my participation should contribute something. And I think that there are cases in which you say, look, we have to deviate some resources here to help you because you're a person where that's why I think there isn't, at the other extreme, I don't think that there's a general duty in research to say, well, now that I have you as a research participant, as a benefit, I'd like to troll through a whole bunch of things to see if there's something I can give you. I don't think that that's an appropriate model. The other thing you asked about was that some people might be discouraged to participate. I mean, I don't have a specific case in mind. What I can imagine, though, is that someone would say, look, there's a chance that I would be, have a susceptibility to something like Alzheimer's disease or something like this, and I'd like to be able to contribute to your study without knowing about that. So I wouldn't want to know about that. So I'm happy not to contribute to your study, but if there was a way I could do it without learning about that, I would do it. that doesn't seem to me like a crazy attitude or one that we should disregard. And I actually think that that's an attitude that would potentially help advance science, because it says, look, maybe there are certain things that we can wall off or compartmentalize, and where there may be things where participants also want those things to be compartmentalized.
I agree. I like the way that Amy framed the idea that, when something hits us in the face, we need to do something about it. And I think probably everyone has that instinct. I think it raises, though, for me, some very interesting questions about, two ends of the question, I guess. And all of your comments have helped me think about this. One is, how confident do we have to be that we're seeing something? And this is Dr. Bendindi's data. We have research scans and researchers that don't read scans, and so something looks like something to some people and doesn't to other people, I guess is the way I would say it. So how do you make a policy about what do you do? So that's one thing. And then the second side of that is, yes, we all have this instinct to do something, but what do we do? What's sufficient to do, or what's required to do? So the first thing, of course, is telling you, right? But then, in the story that you experienced, Dr. Hilgenberger, you had Stanford Medical School in a certain way at your disposal. And so many people, especially in a research context, don't. And so if we just tell them, you have something on your scan and you need to go follow up, what's our obligation as researchers, I guess? How far does it go? Do we have to find them the next level of scan? Do we have to do the clinical scans every year? Do we have to refer? Do we have to pay for the care? There's so many questions that follow on that are not easily answered, but I think are part of what we have to struggle with in terms of what does it mean to have an obligation to do something. And then the last thing I want to say, and this gets back to the earlier panel, I think, Lisa set up research, clinical care, and direct-to-consumer. And I think that the contexts are very important in terms of how these questions get answered. But I want to highlight that Mildred added a fourth context to that we didn't think about, and that's public health. And public health has some really different implications in terms of, using whole genome sequencing for screening everybody, and what does that mean in terms of what the minimum results are that we need to return and to whom. I think so. Those are other questions, I guess, that we need to talk about. Doesn't require anybody's answer.
Well, it's an important discussion for the commission. Do any of you want to comment before we go to the next
Well,
question?
just very quickly, actually, I think that is the framework. I think nobody disagrees that when something jumps out, you should do something. But that is exactly right. Something will jump out more in certain scans than other scans. And then the really difficult question is, you can keep on looking, but it's a slippery slope. You can devote all kinds of resources, and then where do you stop? And should that be context dependent in some sense? So,
Yeah.
Can I just say, it's not a slippery slope. That is, it doesn't have to be a slippery slope. It's only a slippery slope if you can't make any distinctions between what is subject to expert interpretation, what has some clear potential for helping a person. So I would just say that there are many difficult issues here, but it doesn't, by saying it's I just want to correct, because if you say it's a slippery slope, it tells you don't start down here because you're going to slide all the way to impossibility. It isn't. That's why I began the way I did. There are some things that even a pretty inexperienced researcher who, if it jumps out at her, let's say, and she's in an academic medical context where she has a Dr. Hauser who she can, in confidence, say, can you take a look at this and tell me whether I should be concerned, because I am, and what, you have more experience than I do, which is actually true in this case, what would you suggest the next step be? I just would like us not to avoid going to what is the ethically obvious fundamental, just because there will be some lines we have to draw, and so it doesn't become a slippery slope.
Yeah, you can comment on that. I actually got to go to Anita next, unless you have a specific.
Well, let
Anita,
me
would you
just
yield?
pick up, may I just pick up on this boundary question?
Yeah.
Very good, and it was just an observation, Peter, as you were speaking and with Chris's comments, that we do have some level of comfort, and I think appropriately so, in clinical medicine, particularly with neuroimaging, to limit the scope of investigation, in part because of the time constraints in a single study, for particular clinical indications. For example, we will often look at certain systems, hearing or vision, or spinal cord, of course, without visualizing with a clinical scan the entire nervous system. And in those settings, we would miss a lesion that was in a non-visualized area.
Anita.
I want to, in a way, continue what I regard as the distributive justice issues that Christine Grady was raising. And they began to occur to me listening to your story, Dr. Hilgenberg, because you emphasized that it was a new friend that you agreed to work with the brain scan, and that with this new friend found the suspicious lesion, the new friend then acted on it in a way which probably saved your life. A lot of us don't have friends. And this commission has looked at some pretty shocking and outrageous and scary examples of researchers who did not treat their subjects well. You were lucky. So I guess what I want to put on the table for the commission is the question of, how do we think about the fact that some patients, some subjects, we'll go to subjects, will be like you, a superstar, that everyone wants to befriend and help. And so if you walk in for the scan, or Barack Obama walks in for the scan, everyone is going to be solicitous to their needs. But if Joe or Jane Average walks in, and Joe or Jane Average is uninsured and maybe needs the $40 to buy diapers and hamburger meat, and if has no capacity to pay for surgery if it's needed to cure an incidental finding condition that's discovered. I mean, what do we do about that? I mean, you raised, Alex, the question of who pays. So I'm very concerned that we, in the context of research, don't unfairly neglect the needs of subjects who don't have resources and whom we don't like and who are not our friends. And also, I just want to emphasize how important it is that if we're going to have a sense of there being a minimal standard, the kind of you can't sleep at night because you didn't pursue it, that don't we have to also have some kind of financial medical infrastructure that ensures that people who engage in, who are research subjects and who volunteer for research are going to get taken care of if it turns out that they have an unforeseen condition. I just wanted to know what the panel thought. I mean, Alex, I think you agree with me that something needs to be there structurally, but I wonder whether the other panelists agree as well.
I completely agree. I think that we should, within our infrastructure, do as much as possible. And then the question is, right, what's reasonable, what's as much as possible. I think that, you can, like at the NIH, we have this clinical grade sort of scanning, and we have a radiologist interpreting every single one. Is that overkill? I don't know. I mean, that's sort of, the NIH can afford that. Other places maybe can't, so.
Sarah?
I guess I'll just say in my professional life, I'm a clinician, and we don't turn people away at the door, who don't have insurance and so forth. So I guess I'm not sure how to address if things are discovered in research, then do you need to treat that differently? I mean, I think it's obviously that's why we're here and discussing this. But clinically speaking, I think that person could show up at the door and say, I had this, and somebody found it and I'm concerned about it. And it would be hard for me to imagine they would be turned away despite them not having insurance.
I mean, we have a system now in which hopefully everybody will have some kind of insurance very, very shortly. But I'm not convinced that the researcher who finds something will necessarily respond the same way to the finding. And so we have a question of, do we respond in an equitable way to similar evidence of a problem? And then will the person who is eventually told, hopefully, have the resources, financial, moral, social, otherwise, to deal appropriately with what's found? And how can we ensure that or help that process results in an optimal health solution?
We'll have an opportunity to follow up on all this with this panel and the prior panel at the roundtable session scheduled for 1:45, but I think we need at least a little brief break at this point, but not before thanking the three of you. All right.